From FingerLakes1.com, welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, today joined by Ted Baker. It's been a couple weeks, but he's back, and allergy season is back as I sniff and cough and my eyes water. It's here, spring's here, it's been raining nonstop, right? In your neck of the woods too?
Yeah, I got out and mowed the lawn yesterday, and it was 10 feet at a time, and it quits. And
Yeah. So obviously there's been a ton going on. There are so many stories that we're going to talk about today. Let's start with the incinerator bill, because this is probably one of the more we've been talking about this since early last year. It was supposed to, if we backtrack to last year, it was supposed to make it through last year's session. It didn't make it through the assembly. We fast forward to this year. The bill gets revived, it gets through Senate, and then it gets through Assembly, and it looks like everything is good, right? And then nothing happens. And that's where we are right now. So there was a little bit of confusion about when the governor needed to act on it or when he would act on it. There was some idea that it had to be within 10 days of when the bill was passed. That's not actually the case. It's within 10 days of after it's sent to Albany, and actually, I guess, on his desk. It can only sit on his desk for 10 days. I suppose that's what the technical reasoning was for. But people are starting to ask questions now. Is the governor waffling, as Peter Mantius reported earlier this week? Is the governor waffling on his support of this bill, which would block incinerators from moving through an Article 10 process, which is the process by which developers or a company like Circular Energy use to bypass home rule, local law? Waffling, too much going on, or something else? What's your feeling so far?
I don't think waffling, because I can't see where's the downside in being in favor of this bill. Everyone wants it except for the company that's trying to build the plant. So it seems to me you've got two possibilities. One is the ever-popular Andrew Cuomo hates upstate New York, and he's trying to stick it to us. And I guess that's a possibility. It certainly would appear that way. The other is there's a certain timing to these things, so maybe he's just got bigger things on his plate that he wants to announce, and he's going to schedule this announcement for some point when it's a slow week for everything else, and he comes out to the Finger Lakes and has a big news conference and takes credit for it.
I think that's interesting, because the governor has been getting and taking all kinds of heat for the last what it seems now is year for a lack of press availability up here in upstate New York and Western New York. He finally did a radio show last week out of Rochester, Connections with Evan Dawson. That was an hour long. That was really the first time that, since being reelected, that he's done any meaningful press time here in Western New York. I understand the idea of maybe saving it for a slow week, but I've never really understood the idea of holding things back just to fit a political schedule. You've got all of these bills, it's almost like you're taking the easy route or the lazy route, because the governor's office will have no problem spinning any bill that the governor signs into this beautiful, big, magical thing. We see these press releases on really dry topics damn near every day. And it doesn't have any impact on who's talking about it. It doesn't affect the buzz. Like all of these all these pieces of legislation, when they become law, generate buzz. They generate discussion, and to me, it just seems really odd, I guess, that you would have the governor sort of couching this one for a later day. I don't really see the upside to it. I don't get it.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the press availabilities, and it's interesting in covering the governor over the years. It seems like whenever he does come to the Finger Lakes, it's for some staged kind of event, and all of us in the media really don't care very much about that staged event, but there's all kinds of other things we'd like to ask him about, and that's always kind of discouraged, and whether that's naivete on the governor's part or on his media people's part, it just seems like the last several times he's been around, when they open it up for questions, the questions are all about something else, the latest scandal, or, for example, he'll come to town to tout something and everybody wants to ask about this incinerator thing. So it's a little interesting in a way that a governor that seems to thrive on publicity on one hand shies away from taking any real questions about substantive issues on the other hand.
And it's interesting because he didn't really dodge any questions during that conversation, during his appearance on Connections. It was strange. He seemed pretty forthright, and he answered the questions. They covered a lot of ground. Granted, a lot of the questions, when you're only getting availability to a politician or an elected leader or even an official for that matter, once in a blue moon, the questions that you're going to get that first time and the conversation you're going to get that first time is very dry. I can attest to that personally, having done 250, 300 interviews over the course of 3 years with different types of officials and different people. Like, the first time you interact with them, the first time you have that sort of conversation, you have to treat it like a 101 level conversation to get the people who are going to be listening or watching up to speed. And I'm sure you've lived through that millions of times over.
Well, and also in a one-on-one conversation, any skilled politician can spin the topic to talk about what he wants to. I mean, right. I've had guests that you can ask them anything, and the answer you're going to get is the answer to the question they wanted you to ask, as opposed to a gaggle kind of situation where if he doesn't adequately answer a question, another reporter yells out a follow-up or something. So it's a little more controlled in a one-on-one situation because, we as the interviewers don't want to seem rude, so you don't want to keep pushing and say, well, you didn't answer the question. There's more that tendency to move on. I mean, it's you've seen the meme about shows like Meet the Press where it's always, well, we have to leave it there. And, well, why? Why if they don't give you the answer to the question, ask it again, ask it 12 times till you get it. But it's easier said than done in a one-on-one.
Well, and then plus on top of that, you can really attest to the time factor. You have a limited amount of time
right.
with this person, and you got to do your best to get something meaningful out of it. And right. I'm not saying that conversations with elected officials are not meaningful, that those interactions are important, and it's important that they're talking about something, about anything, that they're doing it. But at the same time, you set up for an interview, you get ready, you're going through that process, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, that was a dodge. I only have 12 more minutes. I need to get to right. X, Y, and Z to get something meaningful out of this.
Do I hammer topic number one over and over and
right.
over again, or do I say, okay, look, he's not going to answer this one, so let's go on to another one and try topic B?
So a reader shot the question over to us related to this topic. Does it get passed by the beginning of July?
I guess I don't see the downside in being for this. So I guess the sinister governor hates upstate New York. I'm not really buying that one this time. I think he's probably just, I wouldn't be surprised if it's at least internally scheduled for some point in the next couple of weeks or months. I mean, I think it'll get signed and we'll have a big ceremony, out in Seneca County somewhere saying no more incinerator.
It's interesting because this is one of those scenarios, and this is one of those bills where, yes, it has support both sides of the aisle. It seems to have support around the state, but there isn't any upside to it being signed in terms of political capital. Like, there's no, all of the representatives in the Finger Lakes region essentially are in the minority. They don't really have a ton of control over what happens. They're they're trying to keep up and trying to pass get a few meaningful things signed into law. But at the end of the day, they're just, when you're in the minority, you're in the minority. So I wonder that if not because the proposed law could affect something else somewhere, some other project that the governor has his eye on or wants to use down the road, if maybe it's too broad, if that's not the case, then the political capital side of that argument to me just says he doesn't need to do this. This is not a priority. if it just goes and it just dies, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's the Finger Lakes. And of course, on the surface, the governor is an advocate for the Finger Lakes, especially when it comes to the DRI and spending those millions of dollars. But when it comes to meaningful legislation, he might not be as apt to get this done as opposed to 20 other things.
That's an interesting theory that I hadn't really heard, the idea that maybe there's some other project out there that would bring jobs someplace. I mean, I suppose that's a possibility. And, you know, and the other thing is, let's face it, politicians are sometimes very good at taking credit for seeming to make an effort to do something. Then at the end of the day, you know, that something doesn't really get done. I mean, you know, not to pick on any one particular politician, but Senator Schumer has a news conference every single Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody ever check back to see if any of those things that he rails about ever actually get done?
I think the robocall push that he has been making in recent, I think that is going to be a sink or swim kind of issue. That's something that there was a lot of talk last year that it would get better this year in 2019, and it hasn't. It's actually gotten worse. Some of the regulations have expired, or laxed even more. But to your point, yes, it's I don't know. Like there's so much unknown when it comes to a bill or any kind of proposal when it's in this middle ground. Nobody knows where it is. Like it's just floating somewhere in the ether in Albany. Maybe it gets signed. Maybe it doesn't.
Right, and you mentioned that most of our representatives are in the Republican minority, so they, you know, they advocate on various bills every year that they have no hope of passing, and they know they won't pass, and we know they won't pass when we talk to them. But we all kind of have to pretend that there's this effort being made to get something done. And, I mean, there is an effort being made, but, again, realistically, we all know what the final outcome is going to be.
Yeah, and another state issue that we've been talking about quite a bit, advocates from around New York State gathered in Albany on Tuesday to push for stronger rental protections to address the shortage of affordable housing, a problem that was originally confined to New York City, but now those advocates are saying, hey, wait a second, this is an issue across the state. Tamara Stewart, one of the people who traveled to Albany, called rental markets unsustainable and noted that people who have to work 3 or 4 jobs to afford rent is just not a workable reality. And I think that's one of the things that you and I have talked about. Obviously, we talked about it this morning on Finger Lakes Morning News. It's just we're running towards this cliff. And I actually think the enhancement and the continued growth of the tourism sector in the Finger Lakes is going to continue. While it's a huge benefit overall to the region, I actually think it continues to hurt this market in particular if some regulation is not sprinkled in, just to keep things. And I would even take that a step further in saying before we regulate, I think we need to figure out what we have. We talked about last year the proposal in Auburn, which was really interesting. It basically was going to require that landlords identify what they have, where they have, what what those units look like. And it didn't pass. Turns out that's been churning for a bunch of years. But this, to me, that's sort of the first step that has to happen. Then the second step is regulation and acting on the data that you have. We have enough data now to acknowledge that there is definitely a problem in terms of how many affordable units are available versus how many people need affordable units or units that fall below that median number. I think we have to do some work so that we have better data and can act on that data with some mild regulations. Just in terms of, I think it's more planning. Because, right, you're setting up a scenario where a community knows that they need X number of units and they only have Y units. So we need to get from Y to X, and to do that, we need to make sure that the folks who are coming in, if they're developing this many higher priced units, that they're also producing X number of affordable units. Or even just looking and being a little more proactive and just looking for developers who are interested in developing some more affordable units. And especially in a lot of these communities, I look at like places like Seneca Falls, Waterloo, go down to Rushville, wherever you may be in the Finger Lakes. A lot of these communities have aging homes and not a lot of new development in the last couple decades. People are moving away from owning and moving toward renting, and we need to make sure that everyone is the whole community is represented in that process.
It just doesn't seem like housing is a sexy issue. I mean, look at the DRI discussions in Geneva and in Auburn and the cities that are still applying for a grant. None of them are talking about housing. It's all, I've said before, my theory of economic development is everything is designed around the big headline. They want to announce this big project. So in Geneva, they build the Lakefront Visitor Center, and it's big and it's beautiful and it's shiny. But you don't hear any of these communities saying, okay, with our $10 million, we're going to make it affordable for people to live here, because if we have people who can live comfortably, then we have a better economy. I think that our economic development efforts seem more geared at developers than they are at helping all of us, which ultimately is the one thing that benefits the economy. A strong, vibrant middle class will lift up the economy real quick.
Yeah, and it's, chicken and egg. Like, what comes first? Well, we hear from employers and we hear from people in that line of work constantly that, hey, workforce folks are telling us that more employees, we need more employees, we need more workers, we need more people. And then we hear people at the same time saying, well, there aren't enough good jobs, One of those doesn't jive.
And I think the two are connected, though, in a way. I think that one of the reasons that housing is becoming less affordable is the change in the nature of work. We're going away from the 40-hour-a-week, full salary, full benefits, 40 years, gold watch and retire model to what's being called the gig economy, where people increasingly, if you're working 40 hours a week, it might be in 3 different jobs that add up to 40 hours a week at minimum wage. I think, like a lot of these things we talk about, I think the issues are sort of intertwined there, that maybe the reason people can't afford housing is because work doesn't pay them enough to afford housing when it used to.
Well, and that's kind of why I preface that with chicken and egg, because if you want employers to come and you want these big developments to happen, it seems pretty clear that you need people. And if you want people, you're going to have to at some point make these communities worth living in. Not just because there's a job here, but God, because they actually want to live here. And that requires making sure that the conditions are right for development and housing and rental properties and all of these things that contribute to that. So there are people here when, that site selector looks at a community in Ontario or Seneca or Wayne County and they're like, or Yates County, and they say, oh, there are people living there. There are people who need jobs. Because it's very interesting, like the amount of disparity, it seems, that there is between what some folks want to say about the economy. It's great. Everything's good. Unemployment's low. Everything is solid. And the raw numbers, just in terms of what median salary is, for example, like that's the number that I keep going back to and I wish more people would focus on, because forget about median household income. The households don't look like they did, 20, 30 years ago. A household might be
right.
3 people living together who don't share any expenses whatsoever other than the fact that they live in the same home together. The family environments is not the same. It's not like it was. So you have to treat every individual as a person who is essentially on their own. And that's why I think it is much more realistic to look at that median salary number, which, by the way, if you look at those numbers, county by county, is depressing. It's depressing. Like Seneca County, as an example, is in like the $24,000 to $25,000 a year 24 to think about that. The median salary is like $25,000 a year.
And this is increasingly, I think, why there's such a sense of hopelessness in the young generation. They don't see any path to being a homeowner because they're working their one job that's 22 hours a week and their other job that's 17 hours a week. And, if we all pool our money, like you say, you get 2 or 3 people that work together. I know in my own family, my daughter is in a situation like that. She's a roommate with 2 other people. They work less than 40-hour jobs, and between the 3 of them, they're able to make a go of it. But, there's we have to really take a look at the nature of work in our society. We were talking about this just before we came on, the fact that more and more things are becoming automated. They're just, I think America's working a lot less overall than they used to. So the unemployment number looks great. Do you have a job? Yes. But a generation ago, that was a 40-hour salary, full benefit job. Today, it's a 32-hour a week, barely enough to make it job at minimum wage.
Yeah, and I'm just not sure that there's enough evidence at this point to really say that you listen to some of the economic development folks, and I think they're well intended, but I just think some of the issues that they're trying to tackle go way out beyond just getting a developer in to, we last week when we talked about the school report and basically the numbers that we went through showing just how big the decline has been in terms of enrollment in all these school districts throughout the Finger Lakes. There are some really big issues at play that aren't directly connected, but they're indirectly connected. And if you're going to address them or fix any part of the situation, you're going to have to address all of them. And it just becomes really, really tough. Another one that we talked about this morning. Wayne County's Director of Economic Development said in the Finger Lakes Times story yesterday that broadband service expansion is basically not in pace with reality or what's needed. He says that it's not a luxury, but rather a necessity, and that it's on par as a utility. So it needs to be treated as a utility. Hundreds, if not thousands, are without access to high-speed broadband in Wayne County and many other counties throughout the region. And this is one of those issues that the state has made some sort of effort to address, depending on who you talk to. It's either worked or it's failed. If you ask Spectrum, they say it's working great. But it's interesting because you brought up this point this morning that it has to be regulated. I think it's basically what you were saying. Like, there needs to be this admission across the board that it's not just this fun thing that allows you to play some games on your phone, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you used the word utility a few times. Can you imagine a community that would say to its residents, well, sorry, we don't have water and sewer service here, but come on in anyway.
Yeah,
but we still
insane.
look at internet as this fun thing that you surf and watch YouTube videos on rather than a necessary communication tool in the modern society. But at the same time, we have this increasing opposition to the idea of public anything. I mean, there's more and more people that particularly on the conservative side of the argument, that want the free market to take care of everything. But in this case, the free market isn't taking care of it. Spectrum or whoever isn't going to string that wire out to rural households unless they feel it's worth their while. So, maybe the answer is, as much as people might hate this, maybe the government needs to pay them to do it and make it worth their while. Or maybe we need to have more public, maybe we need to think of it the same way we think of a water and sewer system, as just a necessity, and the communities will take it over.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just quickly Googled it's so broad that you don't even know what are all of the utilities. So you got gas, water, cable, telephone. It's ironic that one of those might not even exist in its current form, cable, 40 or 50 years from now, and yet it's still a utility, and it'll still probably be regulated at that point as such, and yet something like broadband won't even get... And I understand the idea of making sure that the internet can continue, or that those regulations don't crimp or clamp down on what the internet was intended to be. So its intended purpose was to basically be the ultimate utility that would allow people, no matter where they are, to connect and create and to do all of these things. Without that part of it getting too intense, there has to be access regulation so that people can get to it no matter what. And I don't know if it's investment or if it's just a little. I think what happens is you get these really big companies who are only concerned about pleasing their shareholders, and they get a little complacent. Like, there's a little bit of complacency in terms of, well, we're doing good. Like, things are fine. And you need that innovation. You need that level of, well, we want to be in Dresden. We want to be in West Bloomfield. We want to be in all of these, pick your rural communities, Sterling and Cuyahoga County. Like, pick your place, and there has to be interest. Or you start to wrestle with this fundamental idea, which we keep coming back to, and that's people moving towards urban centers, period. And this is one of those scenarios where I think it's a this or that. So you're either going to have to make these rural communities worthwhile to live in, or you're going to see people move away from them because they aren't livable. It is, I'm not sure we're that far away from a place where, I'll take my job as an example, working for a digital media company. If a community didn't have broadband access, it wouldn't even be an option to live. Like, I could not exist. And, I threw the example out this morning, farms. Farming relies heavily on broadband access now because of how, especially larger farms, how they're managed, how, it's just so complex.
Yeah, I mean, communicating with your markets, weather information for your crop planning, the financial side of things. Yeah. I mean, it's... And, you talk about, are we going to see a day when we have nothing in America but cities and empty land? And I can't say definitively that won't happen.
And it's interesting because one of the things that I mentioned before we came on was with some of these issues, we were chatting a little bit about the Green New Deal. They feel more like a nuclear bomb than they do anything else. And maybe if there is silver lining in any of these really what people think are black and white or really extreme solutions to the problems that we have right now, is that good or bad, they're going to create a ground zero. And from that point, it won't be, well, we have to start thinking about ways to fix this. It will be, we have to fix this, period. And maybe there's benefit to that. Maybe we're at a place now where that's the only way that change is ever going to happen. Meaningful change is really ever going to happen. Relying on the conventions of the last 50 years, probably not going to work now. And maybe we do need to think about those methods as ways to fix our problems if we're not going to sit down at a table with people who disagree with us and come up with a compromise, a real solution, which would save us a whole lot of pain and a whole lot of torture in the process.
Well, you mentioned the conventions of the last 50 years. That's a great phrase. The problem is there are a lot of people who have all kinds of money invested in those conventions. I mean, look at fossil fuel. If you're an oil company or a coal mining company or some kind of petrochemical company, then you really don't want to hear about solar and wind power and no more fracking and all this kind of thing. So to find a solution, we have to try to figure out how these industries can evolve or can be helped along, or if they're going to be shut down, how they're going to be slowly transitioned out so they don't have to lay off all their workers. I mean, it's... the buggy whip industry. People always talk about buggy whips. At one time that was a really necessary thing. Now it isn't anymore. So that's I thought the Green New Deal was a great first attempt to look at all these issues as sort of going together, like we talk about, our kind of overarching themes that we have. But then look what happened to it. It got dismissed out of hand almost immediately as crazy, pie in the sky, too costly. And then I always go back to John F. Kennedy's declaration in 1960, we were going to the moon. I mean, crazy. Moon? We can't go to the moon. Costs too much. We don't have the rockets. It'll never work. But we put our minds to it and did it.
Yeah, and there is so much when it comes to issues like this. There's so much.
Change is hard. I mean, change is hard, but I think you just said it a minute ago. We can either start to put the building blocks in place now, or we can wait until we're over the edge of the cliff and go, anybody got a parachute?
Yeah, and you mentioned the coal mining, the coal production side of it, and it made me think, like, okay, so there's a pretty solid example that a lot of people have heard on cable news and things like that, especially through the last presidential cycle. But it's like, what happens when those communities, which are rural communities, are becoming older, more elderly communities? And when you have these rural communities losing their 40 and under population, continuing to get older, but holding on to these old ideas, we're going towards a place where it's not going to be a matter of, there isn't going to be anyone 20 years from now saying, oh God, what about those coal jobs? Or what about those? I just don't think we're going to be there, because in a lot of these communities, what you're going to end up having is just nobody. You're going to just have nothing, because these people are going to, the older community or the older people will have passed away, unfortunately, and the younger people will have left years ago. They're gone. They're gone. They're in urban centers. They're in places where change happens without a lot of friction, and life goes on, and there are some challenges, and it's hard, but you know what? It's happening, so get on board.
Look what happened, though. In 2016, Hillary Clinton went to, I think it was West Virginia, and was talking to the coal mining community and she said, these jobs are going to go away. It wasn't meant as a threat or as punishment. It was meant as a wake-up call, saying that you have to start planning. We are going to run out of these fossil fuels. You have to get ready for this. My administration will help you do that. And she got ripped.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because it's almost like if you're one of those people who, and I'm sure there are people listening to this right now who are saying, well, that's just a liberal take. That's just a progressive, and they're throwing the names onto it. But at the end of the day, it's reality, right? Because
we're going to run out. We're going to run out of fossil fuels. I don't care if you're left or right. They're finite. When they're gone, what do we do next?
And take a step back from that is, you can't make the argument now that you have two generations of people going two separate directions. And the younger generation doesn't care that this is the way it's been or that's the way it was for the last 50 years. They just don't. Life is going to carry on. I don't think doomsday is going to happen in 2030 if the Green New Deal doesn't happen. I don't think that the globe is going to implode in 2050 or 2075 or even 2300. But we just have to, we have access to so much information. We're such an intelligent species as humans. The fact that we can't step back and come to some sort of sensible solution here and find a way for all parts to work and all things to work it's mind-boggling to me. It's absolutely mind-boggling.
It's hard to step back. It really is. Our whole system, our system of government, our system of media, our system of society, I think, is all built around the day-to-day headline rather than this whole overarching, the vision thing, as somebody once put it. What is America going to look like in 2075? I mean, just, go back in the other direction 50, 60 years. Who could have imagined? Well, I mean, I just saw a picture the other day. It was an ad from a magazine back in the 50s or something about computers, and it said, someday we'll have these in our home. And it was, the size of half this room.
Yeah.
And now it's our phone. I mean, so there's going to be things out there that we can't even envision now, but we at least have to start trying to envision it, I think.
So last week, Jackie and I talked about a veto proposal put forward by Senator Funke. We basically had this debate about whether it was fluff or whether it was really functional, something that could work. Essentially, it would put anything that equates to or equals a tax increase up to a public vote. Not referendum style, but it would be a ballot measure. And then that thing would either be approved or disproved by the people.
By 10% of the people who bothered to show up to vote.
Right. So Jackie basically said she had an issue with it, mostly due to the fact that it kind of circumvented the intent of what she thought good government was, which is you elect people to do this, like elect good people, and you don't have to worry about this. But like you just said, you're talking about 10% of the population of registered voters, of people who are voting, especially in some of these more rural communities. I have questions about how effective something like this would be in real practice, especially after, I basically said I think it's a good idea last week on paper, but having thought about it a little bit, it's almost as if you're creating a scenario where we just get to see another election with the same result.
Well, and then the other thing is when you do everything by referendum, everything is subject to the passions of the day. One of the reasons we have representative government is that we trust that the people that we elect will study these issues for us and not be swayed by, this week's partisan feeling. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have the system we have at the federal government level. We have the House of Representatives, which is the people's house, and then we have the Senate, which is meant to be the much more deliberative, slower moving, let's look at this real hard body. So I think I'm with Jackie on that. I just think that the reason that we have representative government is because, we really don't want government by which way the wind blows this week.
So we've got a bunch of reader questions that I want to they're just quick hitters that I want to jump through. Your take on the 6th Ward in Geneva, where things stand right now and where you sort of think they're going to go over the next several months. Do you think City Council is going to be able to do anything meaningful with this, given what we now know?
I haven't gone into this in depth probably as much as I should. I mean, my understanding is that there's some upset about the whole process, and I think that the largely poorer residents of the 6th Ward just feel like their voice isn't being heard. I mean, it goes back to, again, everything goes back to our greater themes, but we talk about the DRI and economic development, and it's always about the big shiny thing on the waterfront rather than, okay, what are these issues of the people who don't have grocery stores, who can't find decent, affordable housing. So it's, I think it's a necessary conversation to have, and I think our communities and our governments need to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs and not just developers and business and capitalists, but workers and consumers. I think there's kind of a balance issue going on in capitalism right now. I think there's an optimum balance between the capitalists and the workers, and I think sometimes maybe we're just, it's going to sound very lefty of me, but out of balance in favor of the capitalists. So I think it's a necessary discussion, and I'll be interested just to see whether city government tries to reach out to these people and say, okay, we hear you. What can we do? Why don't you feel like your voice is being heard? And what can we do to make sure that it is and make sure that your interests are included?
Yeah, and it seems to be embedded in the fact that that district, that ward, seemed to, their voice was heard, as in it was spoken. It was made pretty clear who they wanted, but it seems like City Council wasn't interested in actually doing what the people wanted, and I think that's where you start. That's where you start to see the issue, and that's where you see the divide. I think that's where it is. I don't see a solution on the horizon here. Unfortunately, when we see a governing body get gridlocked, and we see them get stuck for one reason or another, whether it's internal stuck, so like there's two factions, which is the case here, it seems. But then you also have the stuck where it is city council versus, or that board versus the community. And when either happens, you get into a scenario where people retreat and back into their corners. In this case, the people aren't really retreating, but there's just not much more that they can do. They're obviously continuing to voice their frustrations with city council. But city council retreats into their corner and they wait. And they wait and wait and wait, and you sort of see where the dust settles when the dust settles.
Well, I think one of the things that you have to do is make sure that your government looks like the people being governed. I mean, there's obviously some racial overtones here. Yep. If you have a community that is 20 or 25% minority, and yet all of the government panels debating the great issues are all white men, then your government doesn't look like the people, and you have a problem.
So there was some talk, another reader question. There was some discussion about marijuana convictions being expunged. I don't know if you saw that headline from Albany earlier this week. This person basically is asking, if you do that, where do you draw the line? Like, how far back? And I think it's something that you and I have talked about before on here, where I'm not sure what the answer is personally. Like, do you go back? Do you just go back to whoever the person is that's still incarcerated for the crime that took place longest ago and start there and just pull everyone else out? Or do you say 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years? And then how do you justify that time constraint that you put on it?
I think what I say is you don't go back at all. I mean, the law is the law. If the law changes, that's fine. But if the law changes, that doesn't now make what you did 10 years ago legal. It was illegal then.
Right.
You were prosecuted under the laws then. I understand. Believe me, I'd love to see nonviolent drug offenders all released out of prison. It's a tremendous burden on our society, and we lead the world in incarcerated percentage of our citizens. But I just don't think. Because, like you say, there's no real fair way to do it. It's either everybody or nothing. So, to me, I'm not in favor of going retroactive like that.
And then we've got this is an interesting one that I did want to talk to you about. I even had it on the list before this question came in. Tyler from Clyde, it looks like, emailed us and asked, if sports betting is not cleared all the final political hurdles that it needs to, why are places like Del Lago already beginning construction on a sports betting lounge? I'll jump in on this one first because it's interesting. There is this expectation that I think by the end of session, all of the necessary steps will have been completed. That's putting a whole lot of faith in our representatives across the state and the governor. I hope so. Especially given the fact that you have, casinos like Del Lago already investing, already building, already altering what their production looks like out there, or their facility looks like out there in Tyre. This could be a very big deal for these places to get in on some of the action that has become very, very mainstream. I have been amazed. The interest in mobile betting, in this sort of new age sports betting that didn't exist 15, 20 years ago, at least like in the DraftKings and FanDuel style that it does now. I am a DraftKings user. It's fascinating. It's interesting. It sort of takes the social media aspects of what was just a traditional sort of bookie setup where you're betting on a team, and it tips it away from that, and it turns it more into a social experience. And for places like Del Lago, I think it seems like an ideal fit.
I think it makes it easier and more fun. I mean, like you say, traditional sports betting was very hard. You go ahead and try to pick 4 games against the spread in the NFL, and what always happens is you get 3 and
right.
You lose on the 4th because somebody gets a big upset. So I think that's the fun of it. Now with FanDuel and DraftKings, you can pick your team for tonight's NBA game.
Yep.
You pick your 3 players and you go up against everybody else. Like you say, there's that social aspect. But to back up again and answer the listener question, why are they doing this if it isn't approved? guess what? This is a little taste of how our government works, because they know the deal is wired and they know it's going to happen. It doesn't speak very well of our system of government when people know the outcome of a proceeding before it even happens. Basically, it's their business to know, and they know this is all going to get passed. Yeah,
and I hope that's right, because I have this, the topic we led with today, the incinerator bill. That's black and white. That's clear. That should be an easy one. But for one reason or another, all it takes is one sort of string to break.
I like your theory. I hadn't thought of that, but the idea that there may be some other project somewhere that this might cover, and some big Andrew Cuomo supporter with deep pockets came up and said, this bill's not working for me.
And, of course, our last question of the day, and it's tied to a story that we were going to talk about anyway, religious exemptions for vaccinations. Should they exist? That is, should religious exemptions exist in 2019? That, of course, is the question from the listener. There were a bunch of people gathered in Albany earlier this week, called on lawmakers to preserve those the religious exemptions. But we've also seen a significant increase lately of measles cases, not just in New York State, but around the country. Where do you stand? That question? Where do you stand on that one?
It's a very hard one, because there are legitimate religious practices, and then there are sometimes political things masquerading as religion. I take a little different view, I think, of some people of the Establishment Clause in the Constitution. It says something to the effect of government shall not respect the establishment of religion, which kind of, to me, means that you do your thing, we do ours. Government will not attempt to impose on religion, and religion won't attempt to impose on government. What I want to talk about real quick related to that topic is, I don't know if you saw this, but Twitter, and I think some other social networks as well, now have an information partner, as they're referring to them, which is vaccines.gov. If you go on Twitter and search for some anti-vaxxer thing, you're going to get an automatic feed telling you that you should go get the truth at vaccines.gov. It should scare the absolute hell out of all of us that our government is setting itself up as the arbiter of what is true and isn't true. That really bugs me a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I actually think Facebook did something similar recently. If you search certain keywords, it will flag them, and they basically put this information in front of you. Well, here's the issue. A lot of this misinformation about vaccines started on the internet, and a lot of it has been debunked, but a lot of it is still out there, and a lot of it is still widely available. And I understand the personal freedom argument related to this, but I also think that if you're going to take that if you're going to make that argument, you shouldn't be able to exempt yourself because you believe in a certain God, or because you're applying some sort of religious tag to it. You should get that because that's the rule. Period.
I understand that, and here's the angle that I come from, which is that we have a giant multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry in our country that hasn't always been honest about their products. Boeing told us the 737 MAX was perfectly safe and there was nothing wrong with it. Turns out they knew that there was, but didn't want to pay to have it fixed. If I want to, I was mentioning this on the show this morning, if I want to start Ted's Salsa Company, there are very strict labeling requirements. I've got to tell you what the ingredients are. I've got to have nutritional information. Yeah. But yet I'm supposed to just trust my doctor to stick a piece of metal in my arm that's got Lord knows what in it. So I'm not ready to say that the anti-vaxxers are nuts. If the pharmaceutical industry wants us to trust their product, then they probably ought to be a little more honest about it all the way down the line. I think there are some legitimate reasons why people are anti-vaccine. I don't, in this particular case, should you be vaccinated against measles? Probably. But I wouldn't just dismiss their concerns out of hand.
Perception versus reality, I think, is a big thing here. There's this perception, I think, right or wrong, and I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword. So there's this perception that government is sort of playing Big Brother here, and they want you to be vaccinated. God only knows what's in that vaccine. But then the opposing argument to that is, well, government is the people.
Right.
And people make up the government. And people are these medical professionals who
and
are
we
making
have
these
safety
decisions.
regulations. And yeah, I understand.
It's like this really fine line. Like if you're making one argument, you're saying that the other can't be true. And if you're saying it can't be true, then it can't be true in any application. So if the government is out to basically kill people via vaccination over long term or whatever the case may be, you also need to hold that skepticism of government in every single other application, whether you're talking about the Second Amendment, whether you're talking about the regulations around sort of labeling of food and things like that, food and safety stuff. It's across the board. Like you have to have that. I don't see a scenario where you can say, well, this skeptical theory is true here, but it's not true here, here, and here. Like that just seems to me like
that's a good point. And
people picking their battles instead of just applying some sort of theory. Like just apply a theory universally.
And that it's a good point, because one of the things that I always stress in our political debates is consistency. That if something's right, it's right no matter who does it. And if it's wrong no matter who does it. It isn't so much to me, my problem, it's just the government setting itself up and saying, here's the information you should know. I don't like the idea that if I search for something on Twitter, that the government is going to pop something up and say, no, this is the real truth. I would prefer to be allowed to discover my own truth. Thank you.
Well, and I think that actually plays into more the debate around social media right now, which I think we would probably be best served saving for another conversation. But, I think that's going to be the ultimate demise of a lot of these social platforms that we see right now. You see it with Facebook. When you start to see that there are outside actors infiltrating it, whether that's the government, whether that's Russia, whether that's Joe Blow in his basement or Aunt Susie down on a laptop in Tampa, Florida, like, it doesn't matter who it is. When these platforms are infiltrated from the outside, and the original intent of them is to be this free-wheeling, sort of free-flying, conducive thing that just enhances communication and connection, you're losing the original intent, and you will suffer. They will disappear. Twitter will be gone. Facebook will be gone. Instagram will be gone. Like, they will not last forever. They just won't.
Here's my question about that, which is, why are we no longer capable of raising up citizens who have the, I guess intelligence isn't the right word, but who are able to determine what's real and what's baloney? That's part of the problem. That's what's more frightening than social media, is that we have a lot of people right now who can be fed patently absurd, patently false information and believe it because they lack an ability to say, wait a minute, that's patently absurd.
So there's a couple, and I think I talked to Jackie about this on the show, probably last year. There was a study that came out that looked at who was most susceptible to encountering and believing fake news headlines, and the age group that was by 2 or 3 times more likely to believe a fake headline was actually someone older than 50 years old.
Uh-oh.
So it basically bore out where a lot of older folks who are on internet platforms, especially when you're talking about Facebook's user base is getting older. Facebook is becoming the social platform for, Gen Y and Gen Z's grandparents and parents, as opposed to their platform. And what you're seeing is a group of people who haven't been exposed to the internet from day one. They don't have the skills to sort of decipher what they're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's legitimate.
And it goes even something as simple as, the phone scams that we get now.
And I suppose, too, in my case,
seniors, they're the
I'm
ones
in
that
that
are targeted.
demographic that gets easily fooled, apparently. But on the other hand, I'm also, I work in information media, so I probably am exposed to a lot more information with which to form my opinions than most people are.
Well, and I also think that all of these numbers across all age groups would be greatly reduced if people were less headline readers and more actually clicking on that link.
Well, and that's the argument
and reading it
in favor of mainstream media. This is what mainstream media has been arguing for years, is you need us to filter out the BS and give you the real information.
They're not, though.
Well,
that's the problem. They're not.
Exactly. They've certainly gotten away from that.
There's commercial interest embedded in
absolutely,
that.
Absolutely. But that's an argument, I guess, for a traditional media as it used to exist. The idea that we are the gatekeepers, we can filter out the garbage, whereas in social media, it all comes down to you. And, who's got time in our busy worlds to determine whether this piece of information is true or not? I mean, you see it, I'm sure I see it, these 3-year-old memes that somebody posts, and you go, oh my God, that came around again, but yet people go, oh my God, I believe it.
Yeah. It's interesting. And there was actually, I forgot about one of the topics that we had to talk about, and we'll talk about it the next time you're here, solitary confinement. I think I mentioned that to you this morning. Yeah. So we'll talk about that one. But for our listeners and our viewers, let everybody know where you are Monday through Friday.
All right. I host the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Geneva, that's 95.9 FM and 1240 AM, WGVA. In Auburn, it's 98.1 and 1590 WAUB. We talk about current issues and a lot of hockey.
All right. Well, as always, thanks for listening. The podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, TuneIn, and Google Podcasts. Remember, follow and subscribe if you want the latest from the show. Also, don't forget to give Ted a listen each morning on Finger Lakes Morning News. I will see you next week.